All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
I sometimes think that the staking designs itself can really influence how major liquid staking is in that network. I would almost make the argument that the more broken a staking model and design is, the better liquid staking or the more urgent a liquid staking solution is needed for that network, which might be controversial, but it seems to me like this is like sort of been the way in the past.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve here. I'm joined, as always, by my fearless co-host, Miles O'Neill. Today, we're going to be traveling to a new blockchain ecosystem to end the season. We're going to be talking about liquid staking on Solana. And excited for this one because Solana, I think similarly to Cosmos, you and I, Miles, have talked about how liquid staking originated in an ecosystem that was not Ethereum in Cosmos, but found product market fit in Ethereum due to a couple of reasons, which is no in-protocol delegation, the original sort of constraints around the beacon chain and not being able to withdraw for a long period of time, and then having a robust DeFi ecosystem. If you look over at Solana, we have a much higher sort of native stake rates, around between 70 and 80%, but the penetration of liquid staking is much lower. I think the statistic Lucas gave us was around 3%. So we're going to be delving into why that is. We've also got Xavier on the podcast today, who is the CIO at Chorus One. He's going to take us inside the economics, actually, of being a node operator and the cost and revenue drivers of validating on Solana, which is a super interesting conversation. Then we're going to end with sort of talking about the state of DeFi on Solana as well. So should be a great episode.
Yeah, excited to get into it.
Hey everyone, we've got a great episode here, but before we do, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Permissionless. This is the biggest and best conference in all of DeFi. It's the one that we do with Bankless, who's a great partner for us. Last year, we had almost 7,000 people there in West Palm Beach. We are moving this year to Austin, Texas, from September 11th through the 13th. And if you are a listener of Bell Curve, any of these last 5 seasons, this conference is basically custom made for you. We're going to be talking about liquid staking, the theme of this season. We've got a bunch of great panels on MEV. If you listen to the app chain thesis, we've got a bunch of Cosmos folks out there in full force. We're talking about the converging architecture of Solana, the roll-up space in ETH, and Cosmos. So I would love to see all of you there. And to reward you for being such great listeners to Bell Curve, you get a special 30% off code. It's BellCurve30. That'll get you 30% off tickets. Click the link in the show notes and then head over to the Permissionless site and make sure that you get your ticket today. Again, that is BellCurve30. Click the link in the show notes. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. This is the final interview episode of this season where Miles and I are going to be talking to Lucas Bruder and Xavier Megan, who's the CIO at Chorus One, and then the founder at Jito Labs. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks Mike. For having us, Mike.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, we are too, guys. We're pumped to talk about this. For most of this season, we've concentrated our discussion around liquid staking in Ethereum. We just talked to some of the folks on Cosmos, and we wanted to end by talking about what's going on in liquid staking in Solana. So before we get into the weeds of liquid staking, and compare and contrast some of what's going on in Solana compared to the other blockchain ecosystems we've covered, I actually just want to give listeners an overview of sort of the basic mechanisms of Solana and how consensus works and things like that, because that's going to inform some of our preceding discussion. So, Lucas, maybe can I pick on you as someone who's explained this to us on Bell Curve in the past? Can you just give us an overview of some of the main differences between, say, Solana and Ethereum, and then we can get into the guts of liquid staking?
So, both Solana and Ethereum are proof of stake networks. Solana tends to be more focused on like this maximally decentralized high performance chain, where Ethereum is kind of, taking some compromises at the performance of the chain. Solana uses something called the Solana virtual machine for programming. You can program in like C, C++, Rust. I think it compiles down to like LLVM, so anything that will work there. Ethereum is obviously the Ethereum virtual machine, which is like Solidity and Viper and a few other programming languages. There's some differences in kind of the economics as well that I think we'll kind of dive into here in a bit.
I wanted to to get into some of the differences of economics of being a node operator on Solana versus some of the other ecosystems like Ethereum and Cosmos. And one of the things I think a lot of discussion ends up coming back to this idea of the blockchain trilemma of scalability between decentralization, scalability, and security. And I think the reason, frankly, Ethereum, Cosmos, Solana are kind of interesting is because they started optimizing for two of those things and are now kind of reaching over and trying to get the other thing that they didn't optimize for as much in the beginning, I would say. And what I wanted to ask you, Xavier, is the CIO at Chorus One, which is one of the most prolific and kind of earliest node operators in the ecosystem, is there's a great post by Barnaby Minot from the Ethereum Foundation about seeing like a protocol. And I wanted to get your perspective of seeing like a node operator. And many times, a lot of the discussion of like what a validator should look like is based on sort of this values-based approach of like, this is what I think a validator should be and what its role should be. But I want to get your understanding and talk about what the economics of validating these blockchains actually look like. And you guys wrote a great research piece. We can link it in the show notes, sort of outlining what are the revenue, sort of the revenue drivers and cost drivers of being a node operator. But I think what many folks on this call probably know is that they have some vague idea that it's more expensive to validate from a hardware perspective on Solana. But kind of walk us through the profitability metrics of validating on Solana, and then we can transition from the economics of staking into liquid staking.
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, as you mentioned, Mike, at Chorus One, we have done research relatively recently. For a while, we were the number one node actually on Solana, especially during that big cycle when Solana was really rising to the top. And yeah, we have quite a nice history with Solana. We were on the network quite early to a JitoSOL, and then we found a bug at some stage as well and reported that to Solana. And we've been very close with their team as well as other teams in the Solana ecosystem, such as Jito. So it's great to be on the podcast with Jito today. Yeah, of course, as a validator, as you mentioned, there's values-based approaches to understanding what would be the ideal sort of setup for a validator and what do the economics look like for a validator depending on the network, etc. With Solana, actually what we experienced the most back in the day, which is what our research is about, is actually just the block times essentially, and what was being reported and what was in the Solana docs versus what like the actual block times. So for a while when Solana was having some network performance issues, the block times went from, maybe 400 milliseconds out to maybe 600, 650. So actually the speed is still incredibly fast versus every other chain. But in reality, that's about, 50% less blocks and therefore like 50% basically less rewards going to validators. And at that point, because they didn't change the inflation, this really did impact the economics on some validators. And we ended up doing some research into like, I guess the sort of, exactly, the viability of running a validator on Solana and like what it costs. And the hard thing about validator economics is that there are so many variables. So you see here, there are epochs, there's inflation, there's different staking rates, there's different rewards, different block times. So it's really hard to put a number on this really for how feasible it is to actually run a validator. However, we did a pretty nice job, I would say, overall with, releasing this research. And I think really the takeaway and the conclusion is in any network, but especially Solana with such fast block times where the variables are actually, even more volatile than an average network. You talk about decentralization on a lot of these networks, but it's really hard. Even Solana right now trying to decentralize the network, I think there's many thousands of nodes running validators. But if you really actually break that down, you'd probably find, and again, like I haven't looked at the recent data yet, you'd probably find many of those validators at the lower end aren't covering their costs right now and or breaking even. So then you have to question, is it false decentralization in a sense? And like, what is that break even right now on Solana to actually run the validator? And like, do you just run a validator out of goodwill, or do you run it to decentralize the network, or do you run it to make a profit? And, at Chorus One, we're an institutional staking provider, and I can tell you right now, we're trying to run validators to make a profit. So it's a really interesting question, whether or not you decentralize the network with many validators, what the costs of that is. And of course, as many know on Solana as well, the actual cost of machines and just the setups in general, everyone knows, is more expensive. You need beefier setups to actually run the machines, etc. So it's quite a fine balancing act, I would say, in any network of making sure validators are being rewarded, as well as making sure your network is sufficiently decentralized.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, just to defend Solana a little bit here, I think the decentralization of the validator set is kind of the key question that a lot of these debates end up going back to. And I think every network is going to have to reckon with this in some way, shape, or form, because as we ask our validators to do more, and there are many different lines of reasoning around, like sort of Pepsi is one discussion that's going on in Ethereum. That's equivalent to vote extensions in Cosmos. And we're all sort of asking our validators to do more. But at the same time, we want them to be, these solo stakers running their Raspberry Pi validator out of the woods and have it be perfectly decentralized around the world. And we all need to be a little bit realistic, right? Because Ethereum, I'm pretty sure, despite probably having the most robust network of solo stakers, I think it's only like 6% or something like that of their network as well. So the reason we bring these economics up are not to pick on any one ecosystem, but it's to highlight a problem where there's a natural tendency to centralize within the validator at the validator layer, and we need to combat that. But to also just outline kind of revenue drivers and cost centers for being a node operator, right? The block time, the actual amount of epochs that happen during a year, that's critical, because the way rewards get distributed every epoch, if you're watching along, we're looking at a table. So at 400 millisecond block times, that's every 2 days. But if you start to lengthen out the block time that to 600 or 800 milliseconds, that could be 3.3 days or 4 days. And literally the staking rate could get cut in half the more that you lengthen a block. And then I also thought, Xavier, is really interesting how you sort of broke out like OpEx versus CapEx costs from the perspective of a node operator. So CapEx being the actual hardware equipment for running a validator, but there are also OpEx costs in the form of personnel. So this would be more relevant to something like Cosmos, right? Where, hey, I can support, it's lower hardware costs, but if I want to support 10 different chains, then there's a lot of expertise and like kind of you want to engage in governance and things like that. So your OpEx line item ends up increasing. So I just want to stress that like hardware is only one part of the picture. Do you agree with that statement or no?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, Mike. As we have spoken about previously as well, I think it's always a really interesting discussion, especially with proof of stake blockchains. You have to keep in mind that running an extra blockchain in terms of like the cost of that, like you said, the CapEx cost, it's really negligible compared to like the earnings you could have from the token staking rewards essentially coming through to your node. So it's never really a question, especially at Chorus, on like, do we have the resources to set it up in terms of like infrastructure? It's actually, do we have the personnel to actually run these nodes? And being completely honest, at Chorus, during the sort of peak of the bull cycle, we ran into some of these problems because during a bull market, there's so many proof of stake blockchains going live, and you have to sort of really prioritize. And that's actually half the reason Chorus Ventures started, because you start sort of earning some of these tokens as staking rewards. And then if you don't have a lot of personnel and people running the nodes, then you have to sort of choose the best networks. And that's sort of part of the node operator's job right now at the end of the day. You have Ethereum, which is a stable network. You have a few stable networks like Solana as well, for example, and then you have the Cosmos as an ecosystem. But the tricky part with Cosmos, so right now I think we're running nodes on about 30 different Cosmos networks. However, what I think there is that every time we onboard a network in Cosmos, we have to spend more money on governance, upgrades, all of these fancy and sort of tricky things that you wouldn't really think about in Solana or Ethereum. They're really important in Cosmos. So yeah, it can be tricky. And it's, like I said, like it's really about prioritizing and being on networks with the highest amount of potential. Because most of us know like Ethereum is a super strong network that's always going to be there. Cosmos is a really burgeoning ecosystem and super great like teams building there. And Solana, I think by now it's really established itself as a mature ecosystem that's not going to go away and going to come back really strong in the next cycle. So yeah, major change between Ethereum and Cosmos in terms of like running the infrastructure. We spoke as well, Mike, about, an Ethereum validators are a bit quote unquote dumb, where they, run the nodes and that's what they do on the network. Whereas in Cosmos, as I know Miles has spoken about a bunch in the past on Bell Curve, you really participate actively in governance and you represent the people who are delegating to you. And in essence, you end up probably contributing back a little bit more, especially on the infrastructure end, because, they sort of really speak to you first before anyone else. Like you are the heart and soul of their network. The network wouldn't run as a layer one blockchain without the node operator. So that's a major difference between Ethereum and Cosmos, especially. And I would say Solana is somewhere in between, where Anatoly and Solana and people like Lucas and Jito, like they really emphasize validators, which I think is what makes Solana such a special network in the end. So yeah, it's interesting how each ecosystem sort of treats the validators and how each validator in those ecosystems contribute back to that network.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great overview of the cost side and the differences between, Cosmos, which is very hands-on, Solana, which is very, I would say, CapEx heavy, right? And just you need big machines, and then Ethereum, where you can stay as dumb as possible and run this on a Raspberry Pi. Now, when I think about the revenue side of the economics, the drivers of revenue for a validator are really what like the inflation is. So you have the staking yield from rewards. You have the amount of stake delegated to you. You have obviously the price of a token, and then you have transaction fees. And of those four things, transaction fees are really kind of the only thing that a validator can control in some ways by opting into something like PBS. And so, Lucas, I kind of point this to you. You released the first client on Solana that actually enables PBS, and that obviously is a way to boost the transaction fee portion of your revenue. And it's been interesting to me, first of all, maybe just an overview of why it is a little bit more difficult to run PBS on a low latency chain like Solana, and how you are able to achieve it. And then what are some of the trade-offs associated with running, a PBS enabled client? And are any of those trade-offs, have they been a challenge to sort of bootstrap adoption, right? Because on Ethereum, it's a no-brainer that you run MEV boost. Almost everybody does, right? And so very curious to just understand, how challenging it was to actually get this in production, and then what, adoption has looked like, and any headwinds you face there.
Yeah, I guess before I dive into that, I wanted to comment on the some of the numbers that were in that Course One article. I guess I was just looking at the Solana Explorer. The slot time average for the last day is like 450 milliseconds. So we're seeing like massive improvements over 114 and even 116, which is like slowly. It's been running on testnet for a while, and I think the foundation has asked like 10% of mainnet to go to that. In that, we're seeing, I think, validators are reporting their RAM usage was like previously like 100 gigabytes or so. Now we're down to like 30 or 40 gigabytes of RAM. So we're seeing like massive reduction in compute and RAM required, and then also the network's running a little faster. So it seems like things are pointing in the right direction as far as like the performance of the node goes. But yeah, to answer your question, I guess we kind of have like the first iteration of what PBS could look like on Solana with the Jito. So Jito Solana is a MEV enabled validator client. Very similar to, for those that are familiar with the Ethereum ecosystem, it's very similar to like MEV, which is kind of Flashbot's first iteration at this. So essentially, it's a custom validator client based on the work of Solana Labs that we forked. And we added support for like executing bundles, and there's some like tip management as well. So, how some stuff to answer the question like, how do searchers tip, and how do those tips go to stakers? Because we think that like stakers and validators should be seeing some of this MEV, and just based on the way that staking works in Solana, it wasn't super out of the box. I guess also priority fees right now in Solana, 50% are burned and 50% only go to the validator. So we kind of built this like out of band system to make sure that 100% of it goes to stakers and validators can choose how much of them, what percentage of the MEV they want to keep. There's a lot of challenges with running the system, and we're still working through a lot of them. I guess one is like getting validators on board. So we're currently at just over 31% of stake running the client. So very close to that 33% mark. We were battling that chicken and egg problem for a long time, where you kind of have this new system. There's a different way to send, bundles didn't exist on Solana before this. So you kind of have to convince searchers to add bundles and support for that. And then on the validator side, there, as Xavier mentioned, it comes down to running a profitable business. So it's like, how much more do we make from running the software? And at the very beginning, it's essentially zero, because you're kind of fighting that two-sided marketplace. think we finally got past the hump on that. So yeah, there's that side, and then most of it's just been engineering related. So like, block times 400 milliseconds, roughly 400 milliseconds. You could have a leader in like Tokyo, then 1.6 seconds later, because every validator is 4 consecutive slots, they might be in like Germany or New York or something. So we kind of have this like distributed set of servers that we run in a few locations around the world that are essentially always simulating and trying to build the most profitable block. So there's a lot of like tricky stuff around that, like getting accurate simulators, getting access to the newest state as fast as possible, tweaking the simulators, trying to avoid searchers like blasting us with bundles. There's a lot of like tricky high performance stuff that figured out a lot of it, but we still have a lot of progress to make on that.
I want to I want to sort of get into liquid staking here, and there's going to be an intersection between MEV and liquid staking, what the connection is there. And Lucas, I think you're doing something really interesting with Jito, sort of merging those two activities. But Miles and I have been, one central question that we've been asking throughout the season is, we pointed out that liquid staking was a concept that originated in the Cosmos, right? That was and course one recent alumni, Felix Lutch, who wrote the first white paper or the blog post, I suppose, about this, calling them delegation vouchers. And although it was a Cosmos idea, it didn't really take off in Cosmos to begin with. It found product market fit on Ethereum. And we narrowed that down to the hypotheses for why that is one, there's no in-protocol delegation. So it's not delegated proof of stake, it's just regular proof of stake. People want to delegate anyway, and Lido provided them an outlet for doing that. And then two, there's a much more robust DeFi ecosystem on Ethereum than there was on Cosmos at that time. So people actually wanted to use their asset ETH in a capital efficient way, so that they weren't foregoing opportunity costs. And those two variables sort of pushed this enormous growth that we've seen from Lido and some of the other liquid staking protocols on Ethereum. I would be curious, liquid staking is growing on Solana with liquid staking protocols like Jito Sol, but it's not quite as fast. And when I look at it on the surface, there are similarities in between Solana and Cosmos. In that instance, there is native delegation. Solana is a delegated proof of stake chain. And while at one point there was a large DeFi ecosystem on Solana, it's taken a big hit. We're building back, but there's a big hit for today. So I'd be curious, do you guys think that's the reason why the adoption of liquid staking is a little bit slower on Solana? Are there other reasons? Like, give us sort of your perspective on state of the union for liquid staking on Solana today.
So I can give a perspective, perhaps. So Lucas, of course, right now is much further in the weeds with Jito Sol, which is super exciting development for Solana's ecosystem. So we at Chorus One, we had some experience. We built Lido for Solana, which I think actually is the second liquid staking protocol by TVL right now, Solana, I think I'm correct there. So that was actually a really sort of unique learning curve for Felix and I, funnily enough. We were doing BD for sort of Lido stake Sol, let's say. And you mentioned, Mike, before about sort of DeFi and Ethereum, and that being potentially one of the factors that really made stake ETH such a big asset in the Ethereum ecosystem. I think one thing that we realize in general with liquid staking, that there's quite, like, I don't know if you've explored it very much with some other guests, but there's quite a big money element to liquid staking, like the liquid staking asset. And when there's a money element, incentives are really important. And so we learned actually when we came out with Lido for Solana on Solana, we weren't able to compete as well with Marinade Finance, which I think is the number one by TVL right now, liquid staking on Solana, because funnily enough, Marinade Finance had their own token essentially. So we actually took some learnings here where it's a bit easier to actually compete in the liquid staking ecosystem and arena, let's say, if you have more incentives and more tokens to issue. One of the unique things about Lido as a sort of DAO is that it's cross-chain. And there's only one asset right now that they're using for incentives across all these chains. And they've had a lot of success in Ethereum, which I know you've explored on Bell Curve already. But one ecosystem that they didn't have as much success on, which of course that we built, was Solana. And we sort of wondered if some of this came down to incentives. A lot of it is BD as well. So like we would chat with Jito very early on saying, what are you doing with your MEV solution? But back then MEV wasn't such a big thing with that sort of intersection of liquid staking and MEV wasn't a thing, sort of late 2021, early 2022. Now it is on Solana, which I think is super interesting and actually a massive differentiator about liquid staking in Solana versus some other ecosystems. But I do think one reason is because of that, just incentives in general and liquidity, as you mentioned, Mike. I also think one thing that we sort of learned in our experience doing some BD for Lido for Solana back in the day was just the fact that if you think about Ethereum, there was about a year withdrawal time. Let's say, you wanted to stake your Ethereum and to be locked up for a year. That's a massive amount of time and you just want liquidity. And so the value prop of that in Ethereum stake ETH was really obvious early on. I would say right now you're seeing some success in the Cosmos ecosystem when it comes to Atom already, which sort of makes sense in a sense because there's some liquidity there. But I also just think the unbonding time on Cosmos Hub is 3 weeks. So the value prop of having liquidity on your Atom that's staked, like that's quite immense, let's say, because you're saving 3 weeks of time. On Solana, even when we were building Lido for Solana, we always sort of question like, you only have a 2 or 3 day lockup time normally on Solana, which isn't a massive amount of time if you think about it. So you can do some funky DeFi stuff and use it as collateral for those types of reasons. But if you're just using liquid stake assets in Solana just for the actual liquidity to sell it faster in case of any events, then it's not that much difference just delegating the asset versus liquid staking, one might say. And I'm actually very curious to hear what Lucas thinks about this, because I do think that's one major element in Solana, especially in terms of its own staking design. And liquid staking is always influenced by the staking design in each network. And we probably won't talk about it today, but Avalanche is another completely different design. And I sometimes think that the staking designs itself can really influence how major liquid staking is in that network. I would almost make the argument that the more broken a staking model and design is, the better liquid staking or the more urgent a liquid staking solution is needed for that network, which might be controversial, but it seems to me like this is like sort of been the way in the past.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I want to give you a chance to respond there, Lucas. But of course, one of the other reasons that it found product market fit in Ethereum is your stake was locked up for like 2 years, right? So that's such a strong value proposition there. So you're absolutely right about that. But sorry, Lucas, would love to get your
Yeah,
thoughts.
that's funny. Yeah, I mean, I think you guys touched on a lot of it. I think, Solana's had withdrawals from day one. The withdrawal time is like 3 days at most. So super short withdrawal period. And I think there also hasn't been like a team that's like really nailed the like narrative and messaging on liquid staking on Solana. I feel like, Jito doesn't have any incentives right now. There's no token or anything. So, but, we're continuing to see like the protocol hit like all-time high marks on like a daily basis. So I feel like the like narrative around that is important, and the differentiator with the MEV side of things has certainly helped out a lot. I think there's also kind of like a few other things. There's, Ethereum had a pretty strong DeFi ecosystem. Like, let's see, it was probably like 2020, 2021. I guess mostly 2020 was DeFi summer, if I remember correctly. So, you saw a lot of DeFi protocols popping up. There's kind of that like chicken and egg problem there, where similar to the MEV thing, where it's like, oh, I have liquid staking tokens, but where am I going to use them? There's not, there might not be that many good options for DeFi applications that you can use your liquid staking token on. And I think you also, on the flip side, you have DeFi protocols that are building, and maybe they see this DeFi or this LST TVL or activity isn't super large, so maybe they don't cater to that as much. I think we'll see that change, especially when you look at what happened with MarginFi and Jito. So MarginFi announced their points, and they do borrow and lend, and Jito saw massive growth of TVL during the month of July. I think we doubled TVL in terms of SOL. And then you see that, I don't know off the top of my head what percent of LSTs are in their protocol, but I'd imagine it's like over 50%. So I think there's certainly like a lot of other protocols looking at that. And, I think LSTs are like one of the strongest like base assets that you can have in a DeFi ecosystem. So I think we'll see like more protocols start to like cater towards that. I think there's also like this issue of like security and trust in Solana. I think, the more TVL these ecosystems have and the more battle tested they are, the more people trust in them. And I think Solana is like finally rounding the turn there, where we're seeing like more protocols have TVL, and protocols are taking security very, very seriously. Multiple audits, like JitoSOL stake pool is 7 audits. It was written by Solana Labs. So I think as we see that protocols taking security more seriously, some of these TVL numbers rise and these protocols get more adoption. And then I think as we see some like larger institutions start to deposit more SOL into LSTs, I think a lot of that will kind of get this thing kickstarted.
Yeah, I actually just have a point on that, actually, Lucas, which I find quite interesting in liquid staking in general. I think branding in the liquid staking sort of arena is really interesting if you look at it from a Web3 marketing perspective. Jito has such an incredible brand. It's been there, from the start. Lucas is a star himself. The team's amazing, and they're building really cutting edge protocols in Solana. And I think even that in itself, and just the fact that, if you think about MEV and liquid staking, like these are really at the core of security of any network. And so if there's a team building there that you trust anyway, you trust that they have the best interests at heart. And you can also use that with Lido, honestly, on Ethereum. Lido was built by P2P, originally, and that was a validator on Ethereum with a bunch of experience with other validators around it. Lucas and his team at Jito have a bunch of experience running validators and speaking with validators like us as well. And I think that really gives an element of trust with not just validators and node operators, but also delegators. And I know, Mike, we've spoken about this before in the past, of like when you build a liquid staking network, it's not just the extra yield or the liquidity that users get. The other half of that is the network effect of like the validators wanting to join your network, which I think actually Jito has done terrifically well. And that's, in my opinion, why it's growing so fast right now, because there's an actual value prop for people like us to run that node, on board it, learn more about the MEV that they're applying. And then on the topic of institutional liquid staking, which Lucas brought up as well, I think that will come in Solana especially. You're seeing it in Ethereum right now with teams like Alluvial, etc. And I think as Solana sort of gets past this phase of the network that it's in right now, as performance gets better, as Lucas mentioned before, people will be more willing to provide liquidity into the network. And at that point, I think Jito is set up for a nice path to success. With once you're across liquid staking, MEV, and you have institutional trust, I think sky's the limit basically as a liquid staking network. So I think it's really exciting times for liquid staking teams in general, but especially Jito and Solana.
I totally agree. And Lucas, I didn't realize that, you said almost a third of all stake right now is running on the Jito client. And to me, that seems like, a perfect opportunity for your go-to-market, right? You already have all of the relationships with all of these validators. And so is a large part of your focus right now basically just converting the stake that is running on your client to Jito, liquid staking tokens? It's very interesting positioning, I think.
Kind of, yeah. So I guess like the staking is a little different on Solana than Ethereum. Like I guess, Xavier can probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that like validators on Ethereum kind of need to opt into running the actual nodes for the liquid staking protocols on Ethereum. Where on Solana, it's all delegated, so there's not really any like opt-in from validators. You can kind of just like, if a validator meets the delegation criteria, you can delegate to them. And I assume that they would like it. Every validator likes more stake and more money. But yeah, I mean, I think going back to your question, I think there's Solana's like I think it's like a $9 or $10 billion network. Around 97%, or it has a very high stake rate compared to other networks. I think it's might be around like 70 or so percent, where Ethereum's much lower. And like of that 70%, around 3% of it is liquid staked. So I think it's like the main thing is like figuring out the messaging on like how do you sell liquid staking to those people that are just doing normal delegated staking. I think like the MEV certainly helps. I think there's other opportunities for like real yield with like some DeFi protocols, like, provide 50-50 liquidity, Jito Sol, and earn trading fees and in some cases, those fees can be like almost competitive with just putting 100% of it into liquid staking. Yeah.
Guys, I have one more question just about maybe a difference between Solana and ETH before we move into this idea of sort of teasing out the similarities in between the MEV part of your business, Lucas, and the liquid staking I want to dive into. But before we do, one other thing, I forget which of you guys just mentioned this, but part of the reason liquid staking is so attractive in the Ethereum ecosystem is because of this idea of ETH as its moneyness or its desirability as collateral, right? People actually want to hold ETH, but then they want capital efficiency on that ETH. The vision for Sol, the token, from my understanding at least, just listening to Anatoly talk, is a little bit different. I think he has explicitly come out and said this is Solana is not a money. It doesn't need to be. Now that doesn't mean it's not as good of collateral, or there might not be as much desire to hold that collateral. But like ETH has made these trade-offs where, I think the trade-offs are pretty clear with things like 1559, where they've limited the supply. I think that's actually severely impacted the usability of, right? It's like of ETH main chain, but what it has done is made ETH as an asset very attractive to hold. And I think there's a bit of a different vision for Sol, the token, which doesn't have to be good or bad. It's just a trade-off. So I'd be curious if you think that different vision for Sol also impacts the adoption of liquid staking, because it might not have the same perception of like kind of hard money asset thing that you'd want to hold. I'd be curious what you guys think about that.
So Lucas probably understands a lot better than me what the end goal of Sol, the asset, would be. In terms of like the moneyness of a liquid staking asset, though, I do agree that a liquid staking asset that is treated like money has incredible network effects. And I think that's basically been proven now on Ethereum. And Lucas mentioned actually earlier that they're sort of now facing this cold start problem a little bit in terms of like, sort of liquidity begets liquidity. And right now you have a very small percent versus the rest of stake. And so it's like, how do you actually match that and make it appealing enough and actually get them using the network to change into a liquid staking position? On Ethereum, you sort of had to, because you had no choice almost. Like it was just so far away, the withdrawal, that was your incentive. In Solana, crypto users, especially stakers, the stake in general is just completely sticky. So as a staker, I think you're going to find basically a lot of people that invest in Sol very early, I doubt they've made any other transactions since then. And I'd be interested to see the data on this. But staking is known to be very sticky. So as a validator, if you receive stake on Solana, you can sort of know and have guarantees in some sort of way that they'll be staking with you for some time, because it's very unlikely they're going to swap their stake every day with different validators, because there's no point almost. Whereas with liquid staking, it brings this point of being like, okay, if it's sticky, how can we get it sticky in a liquid staking protocol itself? And to do that, what we actually found on Ethereum, and I remember back in the days, early Lido, the curve pool was massive here. The stake ETH curve pool, because there's just so many fees flowing through it. And then I was like, wow, there's fees. I can borrow with my asset. There's a lot to do. And I think in general, probably there's more to do in the Ethereum ecosystem compared to what you can do in Solana. So I actually think that money side and that collateral and that change of hands and like the flexibility of stake ETH is very different to what you would have with like stake Sol, where like even me as a Sol staker myself right now, I can tell you sort of honestly, I'm actually not using stake Sol, because for me, I'm just securing the network with my Sol. I'm quite passive. So as Lucas was saying before, you need to sort of give something appealing enough for them to get interactive with the network. And in general, I think probably, as you've seen on Solana, there's less exciting things to do right now potentially than there was in the past. Like there's a lot of things being built, but when there's a lot of liquidity and volume flying everywhere, there's sort of FOMO and people are moving around a lot, like for the best opportunity. Whereas right now in a bear market, the opportunities are a lot less. And I think that in itself probably, reduces the amount of people wanting to liquid stake. So yeah, I think my argument here would be like the moneyness of ETH as an asset is sort of a reason why I think it was more popular on Ethereum. But I think even if Solana isn't like money in itself, if Anatoly doesn't want it to be like that, I think honestly that doesn't matter so much, because it'll be more to do with like what you can do with a liquid staking asset. The more volume, the more liquidity that comes to the network, the more validators that run the software, Also, maybe there's more MEV solutions that are built on Solana that you don't have on Ethereum, and it just becomes more exciting in general. And then there's FOMO, there's opportunity. So I do expect in this next cycle on Solana, especially, liquid staking will really start taking off when these opportunities start becoming more obvious. And that's what's going to give you the incentive to use Sol in a different way to what you use it as like a passive staker. That could be completely wrong, but that's how I could see it. And I'd be interested to hear from you, Lucas, actually, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at some point that will probably change for Solana. I think the foundation, it's not like the highest, making it money or like ultrasound money or whatever you want to call it isn't the highest priority for the foundation right now. And I think those are things that, Ethereum's been out since like 2014 or something like that. And they just had EIP 1559 in this like money narrative form. So I think that that can certainly happen to Solana later. I think it just comes down to like usability. And I think, trying to solve that chicken and egg problem. I think there's a lot of hardcore builders on Solana that are focused on solving that for liquid staking. So I expect that to like get better over time.
Maybe just changing gears a little bit, I'd love to get into, I guess, delegation within liquid staking protocols on Solana. We've talked a lot about delegation strategies and really the role of LSTs and their delegation strategies within the broader ecosystem on Ethereum and Cosmos before. And so just a level set on Ethereum, you have, say, Lido that has a curated set of node operators, and they worked very hard to ensure that that is the most, diverse set of node operators possible, both in terms of their location, their client types, everything, right? And so, you can look at it as a force of decentralization versus giving users just the ability to choose. And in Cosmos, you're picking, again, it's a curated set, but it's a subset of an active set of, say, 150 validators. And on that side, it goes beyond just the technical sort of qualities. It also gets into qualitative things like, does this validator participate in governance? Do they, contribute to some of the core development, right? And I'd love to compare kind of, those two approaches to how it looks on Solana. And, as I understand, there's a bit more automation that you can do in terms of your delegation strategies. And so, yeah, Lucas, I'd love to hear, first of all, does Jito have a curated set of node operators that it, distributes delegations across? And what does the strategy look like compared to, say, like a Lido?
Yeah. So, right now there's a curated set, and the minimum criteria for Jito is running the Jito Solana validator client. So if you're staking Sol and Jito Sol, then you're earning the normal inflation from the network plus MEV. That's something that we're like researching a lot. We're spending a lot of resources on this right now. I think there's a lot of there's certainly still like some automation involved with running even a curated set. So like stake pool receives new stake of this curated set. Which validator do you delegate that stake to? If you have like bad performing validators or ones that have a lot of downtime, or maybe they're not, most of the rewards on Solana come from voting on the correct fork in like a there's like a slight time manner to it, but basically most of the rewards come from voting on the right fork. So there's some monitoring around credits. I call them vote credits, basically how many times you're landing on the right fork. And yeah, a lot of the Solana protocols like use some form of automation. I think something that we're like doing a lot right now. We're actually in the process of building a system that will fully automate. It'll have the ability to fully automate any stake pool, and it'll live purely on chain. So you will be able to basically have a network of keepers that are like uploading these metrics on chain, or even just like some of these metrics exist on chain already. So just copying them from one account to the other and having like history of how well the validator is voting and what their commission was. and basically like transitioning to a system that is like fully automated and doesn't rely on any like single party to run. So I think there's a lot of interesting things there. Like, you can look at like validators locations and what version they're running, how well are they doing on voting, how many blocks are they skipping, things like that. And basically generate scores on chain and have your delegation, all your delegation logic live on chain. And basically it's like a fully automated stake pool at that point.
That's really interesting. And obviously it's very different because Jito doesn't have a DAO, as far as I understand. They would vote on these things with a token, right? And Xavier, maybe you can compare to when you migrated Lido, over to Solana. I mean, was it more or less, let's just copy and paste the same approach that we take on Ethereum? And when you did that, were there learnings around like, okay, this works the same, but maybe this is a little bit different on Solana and it's not working quite as well? Curious if there were any learnings from that.
Yeah, no, it's certainly it was similar when we went to Solana with Lido in terms of like a core group of 5 validators that were very active in Solana already. I want to plug in actually some research again here that Felix Luch, Chorus One alumni, has posted quite a while ago. So he wrote an article on how proof of stake networks nurture decentralization, and it talks a lot about, and we'll put it in the show notes hopefully, it talks a lot about how foundations in the past have delegated essentially to different validators and their criteria. So I just want to list a few here that I think are pretty interesting. So essentially every network does it differently. And in the past, Felix and I have worked quite a lot with different types of foundations, and maybe in the future, we might even work with Jito potentially to like help them as they try and decentralize their network. But there are some sort of 4 categories that Felix has put them in terms of like what to look at when you want to onboard a validator and or delegate to them if you're a foundation. So it's performance and participation, ecosystem contributions, security and decentralization, and other. And then performance, Lucas mentioned a few just then, where you have like uptime, was there testnet participation, how active are you in governance, can you prove that? Ecosystem contributions, like a lot of this is sort of subjective and qualitative, so it can be hard to rate, let's say. And Lucas just said that his logic is on chain, so it might be more difficult for the fully on chain types of stuff. But certainly for Lido, they definitely look at community contributions, for example, and also tooling contributions. And also security and decentralization. Probably imagine you're already doing this at Jito, Lucas, but you look at the data centers where they're set up, the geographies of them as well. Lido has an application process, which is a really massive process. So we actually have someone at Chorus One who spends a considerable amount of time just reviewing node operators applying for Lido, and that in itself takes a long time. And I imagine Jito and the Jito Foundation has a very similar thing where they have to actually review everything, make sure everything's up to scratch. The application itself can actually determine, the amount of delegations that you get. You also have infrastructure due diligence and, the stake that a validator has versus the rest of the network already. And then, finally, something interesting to think about, which is very prevalent in Cosmos, actually, which I'd be curious, Lucas, if you look at this at all in Jito. But in Cosmos, they look at the commission quite a lot. So there's actually, in Cosmos, they refuse to delegate to you if the foundation refuses. If you have a commission over a certain percent. So if your commission is 8%, they'll say, we're only going to delegate to you if you bring it down to 5%. So this is actually probably the major item, I would say, that a lot of foundations look at when they try and decentralize the network for delegation. So yeah, I don't know, Lucas, do you actually look at this or any of these types of items when you're looking to delegate?
Just because it's curated, we do look at a lot of those things. I think there'll probably still be like some human in the loop for certain things, like some of these things that are off chain. But I think on Solana, the biggest impact of the staking rewards is the voting performance, like uptime. A lot of things go into that, like server quality, are you running on a good internet connection, so on. And then the commission, as you mentioned. So, if you have a lot of validators that have a high commission rate, like 10% or higher, then that starts to have a massive impact on the like yield. And, there's some stake pools that have higher commission than others, and those tend to have a little bit lower yield. I think there's also a trade-off, like you probably don't want to try to avoid this like race to the bottom where people are just taking 0% fees. So I think some interesting ideas around that, like how do you you want high quality operators that are like making a living on this and like are making money to buy server upgrades and run like a good operation. So you want to support those as well. And commission is like the main way they make money.
Yeah. The automation strategy, I feel like that's maybe something that's, and whatever the meme is, only possible on Solana.
Yeah.
It just in it, right? It's OPOS.
Yeah.
It's tricky with Ethereum because there are node operators that have many different validators. So you could easily just find yourself, it's hard to assess the entities that actually own all of these different validators with 32 ETH. So it'd be much more difficult. And then if we're talking about with Cosmos, it's much more involved. So I feel like that's such a classic Solana mindset of we should just automate this kind of thing.
I mean,
that feels on
yeah.
point.
Yeah, we were like, why don't we I mean, there's some other liquid staking protocols in Solana that do this, but I feel like it's like LSTs are like pretty important base asset for DeFi, but a lot of them aren't. Like a lot of them on Solana still kind of rely on like some centralized party or centralized like server running to operate them. So we're thinking a lot, how do we just like move this totally on chain, make this data available to anyone so anyone can actually like read the chain and read these stats? How do you generate scoring algorithms for these validators on chain and for the things that you can? And then how do you actually like build a stake pool that will basically fully run itself? And there's a lot of engineering work, but also like incentives and things that we have to think about as well. Because I think the incentive piece to get more than one person running it is pretty important.
Yeah, agreed with that. One thing I want to return to this line of questioning that Miles opened up earlier in this episode, but Jito originally started by tackling the MEV problem on Solana. And then recently with the announcement of Jito Sol, and you've kind of transitioned into also doing liquid staking. And it sort of reminds me a little bit. We had a conversation with Sam Kazemian of Frax, who on the surface looks like are doing a lot of things and a lot of different products. But when you boil it down to what the internal competencies are, it is managing assets and liabilities. And he actually expanded the definition of stable coins to it's very similar thing that you're doing in stable coins as you're doing to LSTs, as even to lending markets and bridges. And when you really boil it down, it's kind of like that meme. Everything is managing assets and liabilities, always has been with the astronauts and the gun. But I want to give listeners an understanding strategically for you, Lucas, of what that connection is in between MEV and liquid staking. And I think Miles was sort of getting into it. Maybe there's a similar channel, and really what you're trying to do is, your one side of your marketplace, and both of those marketplaces are validators. So there's kind of a natural synergy there. But also, I'm wondering if yield, right? Like you guys are, I think, the only one on Solana right now which is actually running on-chain auctions, right? And there's probably a yield advantage that you can give your LST versus other providers. So you gotta just walk us through strategically how this all ended up playing out.
I guess the initial idea is like, how do we like build like a MEV DAO? And it's kind of like two buzzwords put together. But my co-founder and I,
in 2021, you could have raised $1 billion off those two words right there.
So I think like we were thinking a lot about that, and I think my co-founder and I were thinking a lot about that. I feel like LSTs are certainly like the best way to achieve something similar to that. I think MEV and like LSTs are there's not like a ton of, I mean, crypto's so early and there's not a ton of like products that are showing true like product market fit and usage. And I think that like MEV and LST are certainly like up there, probably in the top 5 of like the two things showing the most product market fit. So I think there's like, from like a CEO standpoint, those are certainly things that we want to look to. I think also, like as you mentioned, like for institutions, I think the highest like real yield is critical to get their adoption. I think you talk to some of these institutions and they're like, when why haven't you used other liquid staking tokens on Solana, or why are you not liquid staking? It's like, well, it's this like risk reward trade-off that, can receive a little bit of governance tokens, but like if we have like $1 billion of governance tokens, like $10,000, or if we have $1 billion of SOL, then like $10,000 a year of governance tokens isn't really going to like move the needle for us. And I feel like liquid staking and like MEV is like one thing to potentially move the needle for the yield to make the like marginal risk worth it. I think also, as you mentioned, there's a lot of like validator network dynamics, understanding the performance of validators. We've done a lot of study into the performance of the Jito Solana validator client compared to the Solana Labs validator client. So we kind of have like a good understanding of like what to look for in high performing validators. I think also like we wanted to be like pretty involved with DeFi. I think you certainly kind of see this with like PBS and their involvement with DeFi, but I think they're not like directly contributing to DeFi, kind of like partially contributing to it, and we like wanted to be like really involved with Solana DeFi. So yeah, there's a lot of like reasons why we chose that. Those are just some of the few, but I think ultimately it comes down to like one of the best reasons to hold SOL is that is because of MEV. Like you get access to the newer state faster, and you can send transactions slightly faster. You have better connections. I think it's not the same for ETH, but MEV is a major drive of yield on Ethereum. So I think there's kind of just like a natural fit between those two.
Yeah. Last question, maybe before we get into Solana DeFi, is how do you see the mix of consensus level versus execution level rewards paying out for LSTs moving into the future? I think one thing that investors are starting to become more conscious of, certainly in Ethereum with 1559 burn, is trying to get that net inflation rate down, right? So I would guess the sort of inflation, like the consensus rewards, which is really talking about like emissions or inflation, there would go down over time, and then maybe it's made up by the MEV part of the yield that comes from LSTs. Or how do you overall see that mix playing out?
Yeah, I guess I can chime in real quick, but also curious to hear Xavier's response as like a professional operator. Yeah, I mean, I think Solana has a like inflation curve that will the like consensus level rewards will go down over time. The inflation's going down. Everyone is betting that the like increase of DeFi and MEV on Solana is in addition to like the work that FireDancer and Jump Crypto is doing with FireDancer to increase the throughput will result in like more transactions and more fee burns, and also more priority fees and MEV. So I think similar to Ethereum, I think the inflation will go down, but over time, like the usage on the network will go up, and that will kind of offset the inflation.
Yeah, I think maybe I could chip in potentially here and how we see it at Chorus One, and also maybe also contribute something up to what Lucas said there in terms of like the infrastructure layer with validators, and being close to validators. And a company like Chorus One, we've been researching MEV and liquid staking for the longest time already. So I think it makes a lot of sense to actually combine both of those two into one protocol or product, let's say, and that especially validators can run at the same time. I think that's a huge value prop for someone like us. And Mike, we were talking last week as well about like, why would a validator run a liquid staking protocol anyway? And with us on Ethereum, which I haven't mentioned yet on this podcast, but before Lido came around, there wasn't really any products that we had at Chorus One. Like we couldn't really even get started in proof of stake Ethereum because there's a 32 ETH requirement, and so you need to build a product around that. And then Lido sort of comes around and says, okay, we'll do this for you, and then you can run it, and we put in the work, and then you'll capture some of the fees. Essentially, we'll take a cut of that as well. I think in a sense, what Jito is doing right now in Solana is very similar, and it's just a lot earlier than Ethereum, as we've mentioned a bit in this podcast as well. I do think one of the really niche things about MEV though is just how much a validator can specialize if you understand MEV very well. So like at Chorus One, as mentioned in the first episode of the series, we researched liquid staking back in like 2019, 2020. It's actually how I found the company back in the day. And we also started doing research into MEV quite early for a node operator. So around the time we met Lucas and Jito, back in November 2021, we were already researching this quite a lot, up to the point where we actually researched and open sourced a Solana MEV client, which I can also potentially get up in the show notes for anyone interested. And we sort of looked at what would it take to sort of embed a builder inside the validator. So when it was our time to propose, we would look at all the opportunities and try and execute those as we propose. Instead of receiving it from a searcher, we would do it ourselves. And so that was interesting. But actually, as we realized in Solana and Cosmos, to be fair, and we also published another DYDX MEV paper just recently, the actual MEV being extracted right now is quite minimal in some of these networks like Solana and Cosmos or DYDX. A lot of it still is staking rewards, realistically. And you're sort of talking about like, when does it actually make sense, or when will actual transaction fees and MEV rewards outlast sort of, and also become increase versus the staking rewards, I would say. And so that's going to take a long time on networks like Solana and Cosmos, at least a few years. Whereas on Ethereum, don't have the exact data right now, around a third of rewards are from MEV. And if you're an Ethereum staker, back a year or two ago, maybe you would use Lido to earn extra yield, and that's you'd use it in DeFi, etc. At Chorus One, we've sort of proven actually in the last month or two we can earn rewards that actually are higher than Lido over a sustained period of time, and that's from actually tweaking some things in the MEV supply chain. And this is like actually proprietary sort of specialized knowledge. And so here's where it's going to get really interesting, because you have a network like Jito, for example, and Lucas is like a gun at MEV, as most people know. And so maybe they're doing some unique things there, which gives them an opportunity to rise up above the other liquid staking protocols, because they're not going to have MEV there at all. And that in itself, it's not really DeFi; it's really at the infrastructure layer. And liquid staking is more at the DeFi layer, whereas MEV is really pure infrastructure, as also Lucas was alluding to before, where builders aren't necessarily contributing back to DeFi. They're sort of profiting themselves and also tweaking infrastructure in unique ways, for latency reasons, etc. So they can put in bids in faster, whatever the reasons are. And so for that reason, I would say like Ethereum is much more mature when it comes to like MEV rewards and that actually overtaking, sort of staking rewards. But I do think in Solana and also Cosmos, this will come. It'll just take time. And for a validator like us, there's always an opportunity. And that's the reason why we researched MEV on Solana in the first place, was because we already had quite a bit of stake. And if you're a delegator, you want to earn more yield on your SOL. So it makes sense to go with a validator that's giving you 20, 30% extra SOL than what you'd receive if you didn't stake with us, let's say. So it's really interesting. And I do think MEV, especially mixed with liquid staking, will be a really sort of area that innovates a lot in the next year or two, especially when it comes to validators specializing for more stake. And that's what's going to make the validator industry hyper competitive. So it's going to be cool to watch in the next year or two as that develops.
And I've spoken to a couple members of your team about the new Ethereum client, and I think it's fascinating and probably ahead of its time. And I would maybe pose this to both of you, but Lucas, will you basically try to, I could imagine if you wanted to be hyper competitive, only innovate your client or maybe offer it to validators that are part of your curated set, right? For the liquid staking token, rather than allowing anybody to run this MEV client. And that could be a way to get more stake distributed to, your LST, rather than just broad adoption of the client in general. Is that something you could see happening? Because I think Xavier, you brought up a specialized client on Ethereum, and I think Lido's trying to expand their set, right? And that's a higher node, that's a higher operational requirement that would probably only be possible for a subset of their validator set. And so I am very curious to see how this will play out in different ecosystems where you can innovate at the hardware level, like way beyond what you could for maybe an LST that's trying to cater and keep everybody happy and expand the set. Generally would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't see that happening right now. I think that could certainly be like a pretty slippery slope if MEV was actually like, MEV is still relatively small on Solana compared to Ethereum, but I think going that route would be like a pretty slippery slope in the wrong direction. I think there might be other ways to like get higher quality validator sets, but I feel like like discriminating who can and can't capture MEV is not really the best idea as like us as like an infrastructure company. But I think there might be other ways to get a better validator set where maybe you have certain hardware requirements or like for instance, I think PithNet is running a Solana clone. It's like a Solana, basically running the Solana validator client on like their own network, and they have extremely high validator requirements. I think it might be a proof of authority network. I don't know the specifics of it, so don't quote me on that. But that could certainly be a way if it was shown that running much higher hardware requirements would result in higher rewards, then that could be something that would be worth exploring. But I think like only providing the client to a certain number of people is certainly a slippery slope.
Right. Maybe it's better said it's a way for individual validators to counter position against, the network effects and all the benefits of these large staking pools, right? Because the individual validators, sure, they use, the staking pools as a distribution channel, and that's great, but they're only getting, a sliver of that. Whereas with Chorus One can come out and say, hey, if you delegate just to us, maybe you don't get a liquid staking token because we haven't launched that yet, but you will get a couple of percentage points of higher yield, and that over time is the only way maybe for individual validators to compete with the staking pools. I don't know.
I mean, I'm kind of curious to learn more about what they're doing there, but I think for someone like a Chorus One, I think that 100% makes sense. I think you're running a business and you need to make money, and I think you got to innovate and stay ahead of everyone.
Yeah, and I think as well, in complete honesty here, this is also very early for us in terms of this being implemented and executed, and we're very mindful of the ramifications of something like this, and ultimately we would hope that the whole ecosystem would benefit and becomes more competitive to create their own MEV type flows that capture value unique ways for their own delegators, and that helps security of the whole of Ethereum overall. So we're very mindful of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and maybe we can potentially apply it across ecosystems. Maybe there could also be some sort of learnings across networks there. But yeah, it's pretty nice actually working at Chorus and seeing the different teams working on these MEV type problems across various networks as well. But yeah, very early, and as you mentioned, Miles, as well, actually, if you think about a node operator like us, like Lido, in all honesty, has been such an incredible team to work with, and can't speak highly enough of Lido as a DAO. And it's fantastic to work alongside Lido, and then maybe with some other business, maybe with some institution or something like that. There's always going to be a mixture of institutions that want to use Lido or use us or use something else. So it's just choice at the end of the day. And maybe one choice is that an institution being prepared for us to experiment a bit with trying to get some high yield with our own nodes, and maybe we run some of those nodes. And honestly, a lot of our work is open source and published eventually anyway. So I'm sure we'll probably give back some of that to the community at some stage. So yeah, no, it's exciting times at Chorus regarding that.
Nice. Well, guys, just one final question to leave on, which is maybe the state of DeFi on Solana. Something we've talked about in previous episodes of this show, as well as Lightspeed, which is another Blockworks show. But the question just being, it feels to me as an observer like there's, I guess the metaphor would be Phoenix rise from the ashes, sort of, after the SBF FTX pullout, sort of collapse. There recently have been, it seems like, a number of very high quality entrepreneurs which are interested in exploring what you can do on DeFi on Solana. And in particular, I feel like operating in a non-gas constrained environment removes a critical constraint for things that you couldn't do. So like LPing, right, becomes much more freeing, and the flexibility that you have there on an AMM, to the point where central limit order books make sense on Solana, but they don't really make sense on Ethereum. And I would just be curious, maybe we could just close because it feels relevant to liquid staking, right? If you have a more robust DeFi ecosystem, there's opportunity cost if you don't liquid stake. So people want to be more capital efficient. So I'd just be curious, get a sort of a state of the union of what's going on Solana DeFi.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of super dedicated teams that have been like grinding it out and doubling down on Solana since the whole FTX fiasco. Like MarginFi's been doing very well recently with their product and points, and seeing the impact that's had on like JitoSOL and BSOL and some of the other LSTs. There's a lot of like, the OPOS only possible in Solana meme. Like you have like Drift and Ellipsis, which is building like a CRM reboot, some ex-Solana lab engineer. And then Eugene, which was on the last season of Bell Curve with Yumi and Hasu, to some of the other like cooler products like Camino, which is basically doing like actively managed LP positions on like Orca and Radium CLMMs. So I think, they're constantly adjusting positions and trying to earn the highest yield. There's a lot of other teams that are shipping to, not to forget anyone, but yeah, I feel like there's like a lot of hardcore builders. I think it's showing up. It's going to be pretty promising, like for the next 6 to 12 months, as a lot of these protocols finish their audits and go live, and expecting some like Solana token launches as well coming up around breakpoint and like into the end of this year. So I think there will be a lot of renewed interest in Solana.
I appreciate it, guys. This has been a phenomenal episode, and you've given us a lot to think about.
Honestly, I think many people in the crypto ecosystem, no matter, regardless if you're in Cosmos, Ethereum, Avalanche, wherever you are, I really admire Solana for the community it has and the builders it has as well.
Gents, thanks. Appreciate your time. This has been a really fun one. We'll have to do it again soon. All right, partner. Great episode there. Nice. It was good to end the season with Solana. What did you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm glad we ended with Cosmos and then Solana, because you can start to, I think the comparisons add color to understanding Ethereum too, right?
Yeah.
Like we can get into it, but there's clear differences in terms of the amount of adoption of LSTs that go back to some of the design choices at the protocol level, right? And I think Xavier said it, put it very well. Like the better the design of staking and the more, that is designed, actually built into the protocol to make staking as easy as possible, like the less attractive it becomes, a relatively attractive LSTs become. And you could say the same thing for a lot of these design choices, but yeah, we can start wherever you want.
Yeah, I like the early part of the discussion, and so often we think about this from the standpoint of this very limited definition of decentralization, I think, which is the hardware requirements for being a node operator. And each one of these different Ethereum blockchain ecosystems, I think, has, there's more nuance to it, I think, than that, which is one, Solana gets some flack around decentralization, but I would push back on that. I think one of the assumptions that I never really agreed with when the Bitcoiners first made this argument was that the hardware requirements are going to remain stagnant or static. Right? That's dynamic. There's Moore's law that's going on that's reducing the overall hardware requirements for the same amount of compute on an annual basis. I think it's a totally fair assumption to say, hey, overall, like this is what we want the role of the validator to be, and then assuming that hardware requirements are going to catch up, I think is totally fair. But it was interesting to hear Xavier's discussion. And then the other thing I think is people assume that the default assumption is that these are individuals validating these networks, where it's mostly the Chorus Ones and the Figments and the Block Daemons of the world, which is fine as long as they have internal controls and they make sure the stake is geographically distributed and all the other things that we talked about. But I think it's important to just call a spade and say that's the current state of how most of these chains are getting validated.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And if you just think about like a Venn diagram between, Cosmos, Solana, and Ethereum, I think, Cosmos and Solana both started with the expectation that validators would be, for the most part, professionals. And that is baked into the design choices of, 150 validator active set on Cosmos, where they ask a lot of the validators. That's baked into, say, the hardware requirements of Solana. But Solana and Ethereum are both similar in that they're both general purpose chains, right? And so by being a general purpose chain, you need to, decentralization matters even more, right? The risks are not isolated to a single app. The risks of centralization are isolated to everything built on top. And so, I think they're going about it two different ways, where Ethereum is trying to keep the validators as dumb as possible, so it's as accessible as possible. That doesn't really fit into, I guess, the vision of Solana and what it needs to be from a performance standpoint. So there's actually, unlike Cosmos, Solana validators don't need to vote in governance and do a lot of other things, but it is really all about the performance. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I would say I don't feel confident enough to make a prediction out of this, but again, Cosmos there are the full nodes and then there are light clients. And I think the Cosmos perspective would be that professional validator, you can be a solo professional validator as well. But in general, that will trend towards, even if there's solo and more professional entities that are operating validators. And then users should use light clients. And in Ethereum land, the perspectives is that we should make the requirements for operating a full node so low and so easy that any user should be able to do it. Probably, I think if they look at the facts in the cold hard light of day, they say that's maybe not realistic. And maybe we do need to move to a system where there are professional full nodes. And then I think there is a light client or light node implementation or something in Ethereum. And I think Solana, you can see the seeds of that. There's Fire Dancer, and then there's going to be Tiny Dancer. And then Celestia is probably a little ahead of this on the curve as well. They've got their light nodes. So I kind of feel like that's the future that we're moving towards here. And I could see in 5 years or so, the hardware requirements being less of a discussion point than they are today. Yeah, because the assumption is that users will just run light versions of whatever the full nodes are.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I do think the native delegation also plays a lot into this. If you just look at the staking ratio of Solana and Cosmos chains, it's very high, right? It's in this 50+% typically. I think Solana's 70, right? But the LST penetration is very, very low. And that's because, the ease of delegation really versus if you want to stake on Ethereum, you're either standing up your own node or you're doing, delegating to a liquid staking protocol. I think that's a much easier choice. Obviously, most people will not, go out and buy hardware to just to be able to stake if they don't have to. And, by building it into the protocol, it makes it a lot easier, but that also, decreases the relative value prop of liquid staking. And, it's lagged because of that, but we're starting to see it come back.
Yeah, I think the most poignant observation of that entire episode was that the more broken the native delegation is, the better your liquid staking out of protocol will take off. And if you rewind the clock to the conditions that allowed Lido to find PMF on Ethereum originally, it actually, ironically, was because you had this enormous period of unknown time before you could withdraw. There was no in protocol way of doing it. Ethereum doesn't support in protocol delegation, and you had this opportunity cost or this desire for capital efficiency in the form of a DeFi market. So it is just ironic. I think many crypto builders will probably empathize with the idea that sometimes you get rewarded for the wrong thing. And I think listening to that, if I were a designer of the Solana protocol, I'd be saying to myself, man, I feel this kind of sucks because I built a solution for this. And my reward, right, is that I don't have this thriving ecosystem that it seems like Ethereum has. Although this is an explicit design choice of Ethereum. They want to limit what goes in the protocol. And I guess this is a benefit of that design choice because they allow outside providers to flourish.
Right. And we'll see if they end up adopting something like the liquid staking module, right? Because technically can build liquid staking into the chain if delegation is already built into the chain. And that's through the use of NFTs and then pulling those NFTs, right? And so maybe something will come around on Solana for that at some point. Maybe Jito will get involved. But yeah, it'll be very interesting to see.
One of the other things that stuck out to me this episode, Jito, I mean, so interesting. Going in, it reminded me a lot of the Frax conversation that we had with Sam, where on the face of it, LSTs, stable coins, what's the connection there? It turns out the competency is managing assets and liabilities. And I think your point was probably the one that made the most sense of if you're building a two-sided marketplace between searchers and validators, well, then if you want to bootstrap a liquid staking token, then you already have one side of that marketplace because you have relationships with many of the validators. And so it just seems to make an enormous amount of sense. Then you couple that with you can add additional layer of yield because you're the only one that's running an auction. That makes a lot of sense. And I think you're going to see this MEV LST intersection get explored outside of just Solana and Jito. What do you think?
No, I think that's absolutely right. MEV and LSTs are so close to the metal of the protocol. And so if you're coming at LSTs from a position where you're already have built a brand basically that is associated with being an expert in the infrastructure of Solana, like Jito has, then that's going to give you, you're coming from a position of strength in terms of trust, that you know what you're doing. And then, I think the second piece is you could potentially make yourself more competitive than other staking options by being the, only way to earn MEV or PBS on Solana. And Lucas, came out and said, no, we're not doing that, right? We are making this client available to everybody. But I do think that that's an interesting dynamic, and something to pay attention to, because it is a competitive differentiator. And, we talked a little bit about it, but I think professional validators like Chorus One, they're building really specialized, nodes and hardware to maximize MEV. And that's the way that they're competing against, say, liquid staking pools, while also being a part of the liquid staking, sets. But to get more individual stake attracted to them, I think we'll see more of this with restaking when it comes in, but competing on yield has not really been a big differentiating factor so far. And maybe it will as, we turn into the bull market, and inevitably people start caring more about yield relative to trust, brand, safety, etc.
I do agree with you that I think safety and security are probably the number one seller, but yield is not going to be inconsequential, I would say, as well into the future. So the last part of this similar observation, maybe to the point about you're getting rewarded for the wrong thing. The amount that your mechanism for delegating stake is broken is proportionate to how much LSTs end up taking off on your protocol. The Solana DeFi, part of the reason why it isn't at the state that Ethereum is one, and they had the FTX debacle, which was not good, right? That was wind out of their sails. But additionally, even if you look at what is driving trading on something like Uniswap, there's a lot of organic activity there, but there's also a lot of arbitrage, right, in between the price of Binance, say, and the price of Uniswap. And I think you showed me this. There was a tweet from Hayden saying this is a transfer of wealth from LPs to ETH stakers. And one thing I've noticed a little bit, it's hard to really fully critique it because I don't have a better solution. And I generally agree with most of the design choices that have been made on Ethereum. That said, I do think this idea of MEV getting burned sort of leads to this unhealthy set of incentives where even if the LPers are getting taken advantage of, well, at least it's going to get burned and that'll come back to us as as ETH holders. And if it doesn't really make sense that these roll-ups are all going to have to pay an enormous amount to pay for Ethereum DA, that's a lot of ETH they're going to have to buy and get burned. That's going to get returned. You know what I mean? There's this, it can be it's little bit of a not great incentive there in terms of the user experience, because you've linked burning ETH, which leads to a not great user experience, to the price of your bags going up. So I've just noticed that. And again, I don't want to criticize here without having a great solution, but I think probably over the long term, that's not super healthy. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. This is kind of maybe tangential to the LST conversation, but that is essentially Ethereum's platform tax. Is comes from these design choices that they've made that really kind of, I would say, prioritize ETH's moneyness, as well as, I would say, censorship resistance and decentralization by making proposers dumb in the 12-second block times. And there's kind of an acceptance of MEV over there, and it's all about how do we redistribute it. And then if you go to other ecosystems, it's about how do we minimize MEV, right? Like in low latency helps to minimize it. So does things like threshold encryption, right? That we're working on over in Osmosis. And it's not a great thing if a Uniswap feels this way, and then to circumvent the platform tax, launches something like Uniswap X, which leverages a lot of off-chain activity, right, to get basically what the user wants. I think it's just a very interesting dynamic that we have touched on this season, because we're getting so close to the metal and getting into these design choices. And you can kind of see like the downstream implications on, the apps that are building on it, the staking yield, the staking ratio, how many people want to stake, how they're staking. There's a lot there, but I think starting to hear the leading apps on Ethereum, becoming a little bit more unhappy with the platform tax, whether it's in the form of Uniswap and Uniswap X, or DYDX, marching off to their own chain. We'll see how it plays out. It will be interesting.
L2s are going to do with this too if the strategy is to bundle, which it seems like it is.
Right.
So, everyone's going to run into this in one time or another. And I'm just very excited to see how this all shakes out. We're in this phase of, it's been done to death. And so I don't want to repeat anything here that wouldn't be super useful, but very tribal, very binary. This is the way, or that is the way. Modular, monolithic, all of these. And you know what? The future is probably going to be more interesting and more nuanced than any of us are projecting at the current time. Yeah. And I just can't wait to see how it all plays out.
Frankly, because the users will, at the end of the day, decide what was the correct answer in hindsight, right? And once that activity comes back, we will see just what the user preferences actually are, and if it really aligns to our expectations from this research infrastructure phase that we're clearly in.
That's the wild card, Miles, because we don't, by a classical definition, we don't have, outside of, I would even argue, Ethereum, Bitcoin, Solana, we don't have anything with real product market fit by the definition of Web 2 Silicon Valley. We don't have anything with millions of users other than also the centralized exchanges. Now, maybe you could argue that maybe some of these roll-ups, or even a platform like Uniswap, is actually more B2B. I think you could make a pretty convincing argument that Uniswap has product market fit, even though it doesn't have millions of users. So a lot of the assumptions that many of us hold dear, those can all change is the only point. So, all right, partner, this was a really fun episode. These were all of the interviews of the season that we're going to do, but you and I still have our wrap up, which is going to go live next week, and that'll be a lot of fun. We've covered a lot of ground this season.
We've traveled across the ecosystems. We've, heard a lot of very interesting, people coming at this from a lot of different angles. And so, we'll try to tie it all together as best we can next week. But there's still probably a lot of open questions.
Extract those pearls of wisdom, buddy. All right, we'll see you here next week.